Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to today's webinar. I'm John James and I'm your host for today's event. The technology we're using today is really easy to use. Here's an image of the GoToWebinar floating control panel. Now, it's fully expanded when you first join, but the clever little thing hides itself after a couple of minutes so that you can better concentrate on the presentation. Now, if that happens, all you need to do is just click on the little orange arrow at the top there, and it'll expand back again so you can see all the panels. To watch today's webinar, you're probably sitting in front of your computer. However, if you're using a mobile device, you can watch and listen and even type in questions. But unfortunately, you can't raise your hand or vote in a poll. Sorry about that. We hope that they improve that soon. Now, to listen to today's webinar, you can either use your computer's mic and speakers or a telephone. Now, we've had a few issues with the computer audio in the past, so if it gets too annoying for you, you can swap over and use the telephone at any time. We do provide a toll-free number, so it won't cost you any more. Now, if you do need to swap over, you just go back to the little audio panel on your floating control panel, and you click on the telephone option instead of the mic and speakers, and then you dial in the numbers on your screen. Don't use the ones on mine, because we all have personalised codes. Now, you can interact with us today by raising your electronic hand or by typing in the questions box at the bottom of the control panel. Only the organisers get to see your hand or what you type, and if you do ask a question, I'll read it out so it's anonymous. So hey, let's practice. If you can hear me clearly, can you please raise your electronic hand? That's it, so just click on the hand at the bottom there. Fantastic, and if you click on it again, it'll lower your hand. Great, thanks for that everyone. Now, to get the most out of today's presentation, I suggest you turn off your email and tune into what our presenter is saying. Take some notes as we go along and jot down questions as they come to mind and type them into that little question panel. Today's presentation is being recorded for you so that you can view it afterwards, and I'll send you the link to that in due course. It's great that you've been able to join us live for this session though, as that way you can ask the questions that you'd like answered. Now, to find out where people are coming from today, I'm just going to launch a quick poll and ask, where are you usually located? So just on your screen there, you can see some poll questions. So just quickly indicate Queensland, Territory, WA, where are you from? That's great. I see most people have now voted, so I'll just give you a few more seconds. 3, 2, and 1. I'll just share those results with you. So you can see, probably no surprise, but about 2/3 of the people are from Queensland, a fifth are from the Territory, and we've got a few from down south as well. So it's great. Lovely to have everyone along today. Now I'll just hide that, and I'll just ask one more question of you, and that is, how important is better understanding breeder mortality to you? So, is it very high, high, medium, low, or very low? So can you just indicate on that? That'll help our speaker understand a bit more about today's audience. That's great, and I can see most people have voted, so 3, 2, and 1. Oh, okay, so that's good. So we've got a nice even spread between medium, high, and very high. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'll now give our presenter the ability to share his screen with us all as I get ready to introduce him. So in just a moment, we'll be hearing from our guest presenter today, Steve Banney. He'll talk about the results of the MLA project determining property level rates of breeder cow mortality in Northern Australia. This project quantified the rates of breeder cow mortality in the extensive pastoral regions of Northern Australia and identified the main factors that appear to account for variation in these rates. Steve has been working as a pastoral consultant for the last 15 years. He has a background in managing corporate and family-owned cattle businesses in Queensland, the Territory and Western Australia. Steve has a good understanding of most aspects of the beef business and in recent years has worked in a number of different areas, including business management, live exports, on-farm animal welfare and the environment. And he lives near Gympie in the Mary Valley. So ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Steve to our webinar today. Thanks for agreeing to talk with us about this recent project that you've been involved with. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. First off, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you about this project. By way of introduction, I'd just like to say that I'm not passionate about a lot of things in the beef industry, but one thing I'm particularly interested in is getting the numbers right. And I was very fortunate in my early working career to work for one of the major pastoral companies where I really did learn the value of numbers and how to interpret those numbers. And later on in my life, I had the opportunity to work in Western Australia in the Kimberley, and found out the hard way that just how important numbers are. And it's a long story, but through some good number crunching and bangtail musters and so on, we worked out really how many cattle we were running and how many short we were in females in particular. So I really do hold high the value of numbers in the beef industry. So I hope that explains a bit about why I'm so interested in female death rates, because it is very important to improve productivity and profitability. So let's get started. What I'd like to do this afternoon is give you a bit of a background to the project, talk a fair bit about the approach that we took to work up the numbers, then talk about the results, and then finally talk about the recommendations. Firstly, who did the work? There were three of us in the team, and they should be appearing on your screen. Alistair Henderson first. He's well known to many of you as a veterinary. He's got an enormous amount of experience in pastoral management. We also have Nigel Perkins. Nigel's also a veterinary with numerous special skills and is well known as an epidemiologist. And Nigel heads up a firm called Ausvet Animal Health Services based in Toowoomba. And then there was me. I'm a non-veterinary but an Aggie, and I like to be known as a generalist, knowing a little bit about most things if I can. So in terms of the team, I think we had a good blend of practical experience and expertise in statistical analysis and epidemiology. At this stage, I'd also like to thank a big thanks to all the cooperators, the producers who we approached to use their records and work up the data. And I'd also like to thank those agency people and some private people out there who helped us along the way. Much appreciated. Finally, I'd like to thank Bill Holmes and Fred Chudley, who were both with DAF Queensland, and they were very instrumental in helping us with the approach that we took. Just as an aside, that image you're looking at there was a mixed marriage I saw in the Pilbara. I just thought that was just so classic of what's happening in the Wild West these days. So why was this research done? Well, first off, most of you will realise that there's little reliability of on-property levels of breeder-cow mortality. Things are working against us in the extensive north, where generally the level of record keeping is average, to say the best. And of course the extensive nature of the operations makes it difficult to get a good handle on how many females or breeders are actually dying. We also looked at the fact that there's been some producer surveys done in recent years, both in the Northern Territory and in Western Australia, where mainly agency people were surveying producers, and producers were telling them a lot of things, including estimates of breeder mortality, and those numbers put back to the surveyors were in the order of 3 to 4%. We also looked at published papers, and we've done a separate literature review as part of this project, and that'll be published separately, where we looked at work that's been done on experimental farms and on commercial properties, where mortalities ranged from anywhere from 6% to 40%, depending on the region and the seasons. But overall, our literature research told us that indicative cow mortalities are running about 11 to 13%. As I've already said, that the industry struggles now with inadequate herd records in some cases and the extensive production system. So getting a good handle of what breeder mortality is doing is what this project's all about. The important thing to realise too is that breeder mortality is an important profit driver, and this has been demonstrated numerous occasions by people like Bill Holmes, Phil Holmes and other economists. So it's an issue that needed attention. I'll quickly run through the project objectives, of which there's 4. They're quite worthy, they're taken straight from the research contract with MLA. The first objective was to develop and test an indirect method for estimating breeder mortality and possible contributing causes. Looking at this retrospectively, that is going back in time, over a period of 3 to 5 years, using readily available property herd and turn-off data combined with simple herd modelling. At its simplest, this means that you look at the sex turn-off difference. So if we're turning off so many males a year, why aren't we turning off the same number of females? When you'll notice that I've used the word modelling, or the word modelling is an objective. Our initial intention was to use modelling and use the breed cow dynamo model, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go on. The second objective was to collect and analyse data from at least 5 properties in each of the following 6 regions, being the Pilbara, Kimberley, Katherine, Barkly Tableland, Alice Springs and the Gulf region of Queensland. In other words, extensive Northern Australia. The third objective was to collect property level data on management practices and metadata over the same period, which may help to explain some of the variation that we came up with in mortality rates. So the management practices such as culling for age, vaccination, supplementation, segregation, weaning, etc. And metadata like rainfall records, floods, droughts, that sort of thing. The final objective was to report on breeder cow mortality in each of those 6 regions, speculate on the causal influences, provide recommendations, and develop extension activities coming out of the project that could cost-effectively reduce mortality rates, and also make recommendations for improvements on the way data is collected and mortality is monitored. So they're the 4 project objectives. Let's now talk a bit about the scale and time frame of the project. So we initially approached 45 properties across North Australia. We ended up using 36 sets of usable data for females. We found that some of those property records were just not reliable enough, so we came back to 36 sets of data. We end up working with 9 regions, which I'll explore in a little bit more detail in another couple of slides. And the data we collected was for a period of 3 to 9 years, generally, well, all between the years 2002 and 2011. So it's a snapshot in time, and the fact is that that makes a difference to our results because, for example, when we approached the Central Australian people, they were aghast that we wanted to collect records during that period because that was some of the worst drought years that they'd experienced. The final dot point on your screen is just showing that collectively the sample we analysed involved around 540,000 females, which is a fair swag of what's the females in the north. So I'm now putting up the regions. They're the 9 regions that we looked at, collected data from. 2 regions in Queensland, the Southern Gulf and the Northern Gulf. And they basically correspond to the NRM group regions in Queensland, which some of you will be familiar with. In the Territory, we had the Barkly Tableland, the Gulf Katherine Sturt Plateau region, the Alice Springs region, which encompassed both north and south of Alice Springs, and the VRD, or the Victoria River District. In Western Australia, we looked at the Kimberley East and Kimberley West, and also the Pilbara region. And the Pilbara region includes both the East and West Pilbara. So how do we go about collecting data? Well, we actually went to all the properties, or all but 2 of the properties were visited by team members. I know 2 of them we couldn't visit. One in particular was for bushfires, and the other one was some other drama happening on the property, and we just weren't able to visit. But it was important that we visited the properties because we were able to sit face to face across the table from the owner and manager and interrogate the management on the validity of the data, and that was really crucial to the results that we've got. The other thing we did before we left our office, so to speak, was we developed a template of questions with MLA, which covered what numbers we wanted to collect, what management practices we wanted to ask questions about, that sort of thing. So if we now look at the quality of the data, what we did first up was got a list of all the properties in each of the regions. We inputted them into the Excel spreadsheet and asked Excel to randomly sort them. When that was done, we just worked from the top to the bottom and contacted each of those properties and asked if they wanted to, or told them what the project was about and asked them if they'd like to be involved. Over the top of that random selection, we had some selection criteria that, again, were agreed beforehand with MLA, and they were, each property had to have a minimum of 1,000 breeders, a self-replacing herd, willingness to cooperate, had adequate herd records, and they had to understand that the records would be, their records would be confidential. So in the final report, the results are consolidated and regional in nature, so everything's aggregated, so people can't be identified on a property basis. Some of you might say that, you know, that's hardly a random process, but because we had those selection criteria, and that might have skewed the result. Well, that, you know, it could be argued either way, I guess, but we had to have that selection criteria to achieve what we did. 2 things which stand out there on that slide. The self-replacing herd was a difficult objective, and it affected our approach, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Finding a static self-replacing herd in the north is virtually impossible. As you know, numbers go up and down with seasons and other movements, so it did really affect the approach we took in this project. The other thing we had some issues with was asking people over the phone whether they had adequate herd records, and of course most people would say yes, but it wasn't until we arrived that we really knew what we were getting ourselves in for. The next slide that you're looking at is the average annual opening female count for each region. So on that table, you'll see on the left-hand side the 9 regions. The next column is the number of properties in each region, totaling 36. And then the next column shows the average numbers of opening females in each of those regions. By opening females, I mean the total number of females that are branded at the start of the year. So you can see the total average was 14,798, and the minimum ranged from, what, 1,300 or so to just over 53,000 females on average. So how do we go about calculating mortality? What was our approach? Well, our initial intention was to use the breed cow plus herd model. As many of you will know, it works on the principle of a static self-replacing herd. And as I've just finished saying, it wasn't possible to venture north and find a herd that was completely static and completely self-replacing. So when we started using the model, it started to become too much art and craft and less about actually what was happening. So, and I'm not discrediting breed cow plus Dynama. It's a great thing. It's great for what ifs, and Dynama is even better for going out to more than 1 year. But it just didn't suit our purposes for what we were trying to do, mainly because of this significant movement of both female and male cattle in and out of properties on a continuous basis. So we had to come up with an alternative, and that was going to be what we call the livestock inventory schedule approach. Before we get a little bit more into that scheduling, a livestock inventory schedule approach, I just want to define what we're talking about in terms of mortality. So the way we define mortality in this project is the death rate, which is the number of deaths as a numerator, divided by the number of animals at risk in a 12-month period. So if one animal is present for the year, that contributes one animal year to the denominator. However, that's not actually how it works in practice, because some animals are there for part of the year, whether they're born there later in the year or middle of the year or sold early in the year or later in the year, so on. So we developed a denominator which is called the adjusted females at risk. So if we're talking female death rate, it's the number of females that have died divided by the adjusted females at risk as the denominator. And in its simplest form, it's the opening female number plus half the branded heifers plus half the purchased females. We did attempt to look at improving on that formula and putting on the end there minus sales. And when we did that, we were getting some very nonsensical results, particularly with male cattle, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we kept it simple, and we ran this past a couple of major pastoral companies who we piloted our approach with initially, seeing they had very good records, and there was general agreement that this mortality definition and the approach of livestock inventory was the appropriate one to take. So as I've just said, that we left the model behind and we started using a livestock inventory schedule approach. It's all about populating a livestock inventory schedule. Important, it's over a number of consecutive years. It's not based on a single year. That's dangerous. The herd records are fairly simple, but as I've said earlier, they need to be looked at very carefully so that we are getting valid results, valid data. As I've already said, the herd data, we validated the approach with two of the large pastoral companies before we went out into the paddock. And once we were happy with that, basically the livestock mortality calculator was born. So what are the minimum inputs to using the livestock inventory schedule? Well, there's the opening total female number, which is what I said before, was all the females on the property that are branded at the start of the year. The opening breeder number, which is an assumption or an estimate in most cases, unless that property or business has a formula for working out a breeder number each year. The branded number, the female sales, the female purchases, and a closing book female number. We even had some issues when we sat across the table from people talking about branded numbers. You know, we had to make clarifications about calves, weaners, and Mickeys and older clean skins. So it was just so important to sit there in their living room or in their kitchen and tear the data apart. What you're looking at now is the livestock inventory flowchart, and what we're trying to explain there is the approach that we're taking, the livestock inventory approach, as opposed to the modelling approach. So if you look at that screen, and just to the left of the centre there's a grey area, and that's book entries or book numbers or a cattle book. So the opening count at the start of the year or the current year is the book number, and you end up at the end of the year with a closing count or closing book number. But during the year, of course, you can see the arrows moving into that book number. You'll see that book number is adjusted by way of sales, by way of purchases, and by way of brandings. That's all fairly straightforward. If you look into the centre of that figure, you'll see that we're looking at yard counts during the year, or muster counts. So this is separate to the book numbers. We're looking at what was physically mustered and counted throughout the year. So as people record their yard counts, they also adjust their numbers as sales happen or purchases happen or and as branding's happening. So you end up with a closing count based on yard or muster records. And immediately below that, you'll see another box we've labelled adjusted closing count. So that's the count adjusted for rations, what might be missing but still alive, and what's missing and dead. So we can come up with an adjusted closing count which takes into account rations and takes into account what the owner or manager might think is missing but still alive. And as you know, sometimes not a whole property is mustered each year, or some paddocks aren't mustered, so it's important we make those allocations. But so what I wanted to define here was the difference between the closing book number and the adjusted closing count based on yard counts or muster counts. So if I move on to the next slide, which shows you a typical livestock inventory schedule table, as you can see, it goes over 5 years, and then the numbers are aggregated into an all column at the end on the extreme right. In the shaded columns, you'll see opening female, opening breeder, branded, female sales, female purchases, closing females, adjusted count. They're the numbers that the owner manager can input immediately into this schedule, and then the schedule will work out using some formula, the deaths and also the death percentage. So as I was talking about earlier on this afternoon, the denominator we use is an adjusted number, and it's adjusted for at risk. So about a third of the way down that table, you'll see a row labelled at risk females, and as I defined earlier on, that's the opening females plus half the branded heifers plus half the purchases. So it becomes our denominator. And then by using or comparing the adjusted count with the closing book count, and you can see that just under halfway down the table, you've got closing females adjusted count, and you've got immediately below that the closing females book count. The difference between those two numbers is the deaths in all females, and if we take that difference and divide that by the at-risk female number above, which is our denominator, we come up with the percent deaths, female deaths as a percentage of at-risk females. And if you look to the extreme right in this example, under all, you'll see that the female deaths as a percentage of at-risk females worked out to be 5.86%. Now, if we wanted to go a bit further and work out what it was for breeders, we might have to make another assumption. And that assumption is, what's the death rate in the non-breeding females? And for the purpose of this exercise, we've assumed that to be 3% or 0.03. So when we take out those cattle that have died in the non-breeding females, we come back to a lesser number that have died as breeders, and then we divide that number of deaths by our at-risk females to come up with an estimated percent deaths in breeders of 7.6%. So that's just basically the approach we took, and I'll show you this has evolved, that table has evolved into an Excel spreadsheet calculator, which I'll show to you briefly later on. So when we analysed the data, we looked at mortality estimates for total females, breeders, and males. Now the males weren't part of the project, but we decided earlier on that, look, if we're doing this approach, taking this approach, let's do the males. We figured that the male records will probably be better than the female records, and we should do that as well. So we actually looked at male mortalities as well. We looked at the variables, including season and management practices. We were able to do some univariable analysis, which is basically comparing mortality rate with a single explanatory factor, such as, example, age of weaning, and then we did some multivariable analysis. An example might be comparing mortality rate with the interaction between, say, phosphorus supplementation and the age of the cow. The other thing we were able to do, and I'll show you these later on, is perform or demonstrate relative risks between management practices and no management practice, and I'll show you some figures shortly on that. So I think it's time for me to pull up and grab some air and ask if there's any questions or comments at this stage.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Steve. You've done a really good job so far explaining what seems to be a very complex project that you've been involved with. Now, naturally enough, there are a few questions. So, Steve, would you mind just flipping back to your slide that lists the regions, please? I think it might be like number 8 or 9, something like that.
Is it the average annual opening female count for each region, or?
No, sorry, I meant the list of the 9 regions.
Sorry. There we are. Coming up to you
great.
shortly.
That's it. Yep, that's good. So the question is, why wasn't the Desert Uplands region and the Mulberlands, the biggest area in Northern Australia, included in the survey work? Both of these areas have considerable numbers of cattle, and the Desert Uplands in particular is quite peat efficient.
So I know the region, not intimately, but reasonably well. Yeah, good question. It wasn't part of the terms of reference, and I'm not sure why. I really can't be sure about why that's so, but in hindsight, it might have been a good move. So I really can't tell you why that decision was made. But certainly, that region wasn't included in the terms of reference that we were given.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Steve. Still regarding the regions, there seems to be a bit of a bias towards the NT, with 4 regions represented there, but only 2 from Queensland. Again, any comments about that?
No, I'm afraid I can't. It's just one of those things, as the terms of reference. I think part of the issue is that the further south you go, I'm not saying this about the desert uplands, but generally speaking, the further south you go in Northern Australia, 2 things happen. Live weight gains increase, fertility increases, and female mortalities decrease. And that's speaking generically. And that might have something to do why MLA didn't include, say, the desert uplands or the Mulberlands.
Okay, fair enough. Now, just a couple of questions regarding definitions. So, can you talk more about your definition of at-risk cattle in calculating the death rate?
Yes. It differs. Well, the approach we've taken is quite different to what some other people are doing, in that quite often you'll see that mortality is expressed as deaths divided by the opening number, or deaths divided by the average of the opening and closing number, which are fine. We think we've taken an approach which is a bit more precise, in that we're putting the number of deaths over a denominator which is more related to whether an animal is at risk. I guess if you say that if an animal is only purchased and comes onto the property in the last quarter of the year, it's not at risk of death for the full 12 months. It's only at risk of death for a quarter of the year, and that's what we've tried to, and we've built into the approach and the formula we've been using.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's a question about rations. So can you explain what rations are, please?
Oh, rations are terminology for what is consumed on the property for meat consumption. So killing your own beef. So on some of the larger stations, that can run into 10, 20, 30, even higher numbers of cattle that have not died out in the paddock. They're consumed for meat. So we had to make that allowance as well.
Good. And folks, thanks for taking the time to type in these questions, because it's really helpful for a lot of the other people when some of these things are explained as well. And by the way, I've just got a message regarding the regions that were used. And so the suggestion is that the areas of Queensland not included was because the properties are smaller, people muster regularly, maybe more predictable rainfall, and breeder mortality is not such an issue in those areas. So maybe that helps people understand. So Steve, that's all all the questions for now, but folks, I encourage you, keep typing questions into that little Q&A box at the bottom there, and we'll break again shortly where Steve can answer some more questions. So back to you, Steve.
Thanks, John. Well, let's move on to the interpretation of the data. So we worked on the most suitable indicator of breeder cow mortality being the total female death rate. As I've partially explained, the breeder mortality requires some more assumptions in that you've got to assume how many breeders are actually on the property each year, and you've also got to make an assumption about the death rate in the non-breeding females. So it made sense for us to use the female death rate as a rational proxy for the breeder death rate. Having said that, in most cases, as you'd expect, the breeder death rate will be slightly higher than the total female death rate for reasons associated with pregnancy, calving, and lactation. So let's have a look at some of the figures that we've come up with. This table is showing female mortality rate by region. Again, we have the regions on the left and the number of properties, the next column, and then the mortality rate, percentage mortality rate, virtually in the middle of the table. And as you can see, I've circled the average mortality rate, the minimum and the highest that we recorded on a regional basis, the lowest being 3.08 in the West Kimberley, and the highest we came up with 11.8 in the Alice Springs region. The other two columns to the right-hand side, called the 95% confidence interval, just saying that if we look at the total mortality, average total mortality rate for females is 5.64%. So what that's saying is that 95% of the time, the total all the regions that we looked at, the mortality rate for females will fall in somewhere between 3.93% and 7.35%. Now the next table is again showing the total female mortality rate, but we've added a column to the right, which is the breeders. So we've done that extra calculation where we've assumed that the mortality rate in the non-breeders was 3%, non-breeding females, and we've come up with these mortality rates for breeders, as you can see. So you might like to look at your particular region of interest, but you can see that for all the properties, all the regions, the female mortality rate was 5.64, and the mortality rate for breeders was 8.03%. This next slide is just showing those same results for total females. Total female deaths as a percentage of the adjusted females at risk. Just showing you in a chart mortality on the mortality percent on the vertical axis, and across the horizontal axis we have the regions. On the extreme right we have the all number, the aggregated number. So the blue diamonds showing the mortality rate for those regions, and you'll notice in a couple of regions there's quite wide margins of error or confidence interval, particularly for the Queensland, Northern Gulf and the Alice Springs region. Part of the issue was with the Northern Gulf anyway that we were only able to get two sets of data for that region, which explains why there's such a wide confidence interval there. The next slide is showing mortality rates for both females, total females and breeders. So the red bar on this slide is showing the total female death rate for each region, while the blue diamond is showing what are the breeder death rates for each region. So if we look at, for example, the all figure on the right-hand side, you'll see that the female death rate was just over 5, and the breeder mortality rate was up around that 8%. So I guess if you're interested in a particular region, you can see quite clearly where you stand. This next chart is what the statisticians like to call a caterpillar plot. It's not hard to see why. What this is doing is
just pause there for a moment. We didn't actually see even the previous slide.
I'm sorry.
So it's just probably one of those little bandwidth issues. So if we just wait, and I'll let you know once that caterpillar slide comes up on our screen.
Oh, okay. I'll go back to it. Sorry.
And just so the audience knows, we are recording the session, but we'll also put out a PDF of Steve's PowerPoint slides so that you can go back at any time and see the detail on those. We'll be putting those up on our Future Beef website after today's session. Just still waiting for it to come through. Ah, great. Okay, we now see, yes, okay, we've now got the caterpillar slide. So back to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks, John. Sorry about that, folks. What you're looking at now is what the statisticians call a caterpillar plot. It's showing the ranking of all 36 properties from the lowest mortality, the lowest total female mortality to the highest total female mortality from left to right. So it's showing the figures differently. The median is the middle line, which is showing, is labelled the 50th percentile of the median, which is about 4%. And as I say, the median is all about, it's not the mean, it's just about all the numbers ranked in ascending or descending order. So on this plot, we're looking at the 75th percentile means that above that, in the 25th percentile means a quarter of all the mortality rates were above around 7%. The median was around that 4%, and then in the lower 25th percentile, it means a quarter of all the mortality rates for females was below that 2%. So let's now talk about the variables that we screened and highlight the variables that were significant and talk about briefly the other variables that we screened but weren't significant. So the blue table on your screen is showing 6 variables: age of females last joined, age of females weaned, and age of females culled on the left-hand side. They're all very much related, of course, by time. The fact is that the age of females that weaned wasn't statistically significant. It was close to being significant, but it wasn't. But they were all related, so we're going to talk about that relationship in a minute and treat it as if it is significant. The other significant variables were region, control mating, and dry season segregation. The other variables that we did screen are on the bottom of your screen, include rainfall, phosphorus supplementation during the wet, botulism vaccination, and all those other variables, finishing with nitrogen supplementation during the dry season. I'll talk about phosphorus in a little bit. The botulism factor wasn't significant because only 2 of the properties that we work with weren't vaccinating for botulism, so it was very difficult to get any significance with those sort of results or that sort of data. So again, I'd just like to pull up now and give you time to ask any questions or comments.
Great, thanks Steve. We do have a question here, but folks, if you have something on your mind you'd like to ask, now is a great time to get into that little Q&A panel at the bottom. But Steve, the question is, why was the non-breeders assumed constant between regions when breeder mortality was so different between the regions? So for example, if high Alice breeder mortality is seasonally driven, then surely this would also affect other cattle classes.
Yeah, no, point taken. That's very valid. The fact is we don't know. We didn't have a good idea of what the mortality rate was in the non-breeding females for those regions. We discussed it, we talked to people, we came up with a notional number of 3%, which was, as the who's ever asked that question rightly points out. So what we've done, we've made that assumption across the board of 3%, But in saying that, what the next step we've taken is to develop the livestock mortality calculator. So what you can do in that is, if you have a better handle on what your mortality rate is in the non-breeding females, you can change that. You can vary that by year, by property, by season, by region. So it's just one of those things we didn't have a good handle on. We talked it through with a lot of people and came up with a notional figure of 3%, but that's well pointed out.
Okay, that's all the questions for the moment, Steve. So do you want to go to the next slide, which I believe is a prompt for me to launch a poll?
Yes, please.
So folks, here's the question. At what age do most people cull their breeders? So if you're a producer, answer on your own behalf. If you're an extension officer or someone else working in the industry, feel free to put in your guesstimate as to what it is. So is it under 10 years of age, between 10 and 11, or over 11 years of age? I'll just give you a few more seconds. So 3, 2, 1, and I'll close it off, and I'll now share those results. So we can see that 36% are saying under 10 years, 43% are saying between 10 and 11, and 21% are saying over 11 years of age. So do those numbers surprise you at all, Steve?
No, slightly, I guess. I thought our experience showed that a lot of people didn't have a set policy with when they culled breeders. So it doesn't really surprise me, but I think it's very difficult when you're talking to people about this issue, because they believe they're culling some of their most productive animals, of course, as they get older. But no, it's really interesting to get those results. Thanks, John.
That's okay. And Steve, we've got about 10 minutes to go.
Okay, I'll have to be quick. Now let's show you some figures, some mortality rates against some of these variables that we measured. So this slide is titled Age of Females at Last Joining, and if you look in the box area there on the left-hand side, the mortality rate that we came up with for age of joining at up to 10 years of age was 4.29%. When the age of joining was over 10 years, the mortality rate increased to over 8% or 8.03%. The relative risk, that was something I mentioned earlier on this afternoon. So properties where the age of females at last joining was over 10 years had a 1.87 times higher risk of death compared to properties where the age of last joining was less than 10 years. Another way of saying the same thing is reducing age at last joining was associated with a 47% reduction in female mortality rate. The next slide is the age of females at last weaning, and again a similar story. Mortality rate for animals weaned up to 11 years of age was 4.67%. Weaning over 11 years increased the mortality rate to 7.36%. So in terms of relative risk, properties where the age of females at last weaning was greater than 11 years had a 1.57 times higher risk of death compared to properties where the age of last weaning was up to 11 years. Another way of saying the same thing, if age of weaning is under 11 years, it's associated with a 37% reduction in female mortality. The other related issue is age of females at culling. Again, a similar story. Mortality rate where the culls were sold up to 11 years of age was 3.98%. Between 11 and 12 years selling, 6.07% mortality rate. And when the age was over 12 years at selling those culls, it increased to 7.82%. So the relative risk you can see there on the right-hand side, depending on which age group you're looking at and comparing, but range from 1.29 to 1.97. Again, another way of looking at the same result is age of females at culling is up to 11 years. This may reduce the overall mortality rate by 49%. Now, if we look at wet season phosphorus, and as I said earlier, it statistically wasn't significant on the univariable analysis, but it did show some significance when we looked at the multivariable analysis. So I've included it here because it does show some interesting, if not confounding, results. You'll see that the mortality rate where there was no phosphorus supplementation was at 7.05. Mortality rate when the whole herd was supplemented was 5.26%. When only part of the herd was supplemented, well, the mortality rate was even lower, 4.69. So on face value, that's pretty confounding. It's not a simple message with phosphorus. We realised when we got back, it probably would have been impossible for us to get a really clear picture of all the issues on a property with phosphorus. So we think a lot of things contribute to this issue. I thought we knew everything we had to know about phosphorus supplementation, but it doesn't appear so. And I think some management practices were going on where perhaps people were supplementing the whole herd, and in fact maybe some of that country didn't need to be supplemented, and vice versa. People who were supplementing part of the herd might have been really supplementing the animals that really most needed it and in the most efficient country. But on the management practices and the data we were able to assemble, we just couldn't take it any further than what we've done. But having said all that, I think we know and understand that mortality rates are significantly affected by phosphorus supplementation in females. And as I said earlier on, this effect appears to be enhanced in the older cows when we did the multivariable analysis. In terms of dry season segregation of breeders, you'll see that the mortality rate at 8.77% where dry season segregation was not practiced. The mortality rate decreased to 2.56% where there was dry season segregation. So the relative risk factor there is quite large at 3.42. So another way of saying the same thing, properties which segregate breeders during the dry can have up to a 71% reduction in overall female mortality. And of course, what's happening is being attributed to other management decisions, and they could be better access to feed or targeted group supplementation as a result of that dry season segregation. Getting towards the end, folks, so one of these last slides here now is showing you the total female death rates, the breeder death rates, and on the right-hand side in green, we're showing the male death rates, the steer death rates. And as you can see, with a quick glance, it just doesn't look quite right, does it? Why would the steer mortality rates be higher than female death rates and so on? And you can see the aggregated number for the all figure is for males it's 8.8, whereas for breeders it's just over 8. So we're not confident about the steer results. There's a question mark over the accuracy of the records. We still think that male mortality rates are higher than what most people think. We did become aware that in some regions there were some common or episodic events when steers would bog, drown, or wander off into the unknown. That's what management or owners were telling us in some years. That's what happened. There was also comments by some managers that sale cattle, male cattle that weren't vaccinated against botulism in the year of sale, and of course depending on where you are that could be a pretty risky proposition. We're hoping that as we continue to work with people using the mortality calculator and this estimated at risk denominator, that we'll get a clearer answer on what's happening with male mortalities. So any suggestions to help explain why this is happening would be very welcome. It's very frustrating. We thought we'd get very good and exact records with males, but it just didn't happen for us. So in terms of deliverables from this project, we ended up developing two versions of a mortality calculator, and they're both Excel tools. And I'm now quickly just going to open up the Excel spreadsheet, and I hope you're seeing a picture there of a data entry sheet, which is very, very similar to the livestock inventory table that I showed you earlier this afternoon, where people enter data across years using the livestock schedule approach. And as you can see, it's got females and males in it. And importantly, up above, someone asked the question, you can vary the starting assumption with proportion of deaths in non-breeding females, depending on what you think is a valid number. Once you input that data, the formula then, I've just clicked on the Output tab, and you'll get the results on the next tab. So it goes through the process of using the difference between the book number and the adjusted number based on counts, and coming up with a denominator and calculating a female death rate for your total females and breeders and steers. And this is the simple version. The second version is more complex in that if you have the timing of sales, purchases and brandings, you can enter that, and it sort of, what it does, it makes it, it refines or fine-tunes the whole process and makes the denominator more realistic, and therefore the mortality rate more realistic. So I'm now going to leave the Excel spreadsheet and return to the PowerPoint. And so in terms of future R&D, we'll be talking to MLA about re-examining the economics of changing practices to reduce mortalities. As most of you will know, it's a serious profit driver in the north, female mortalities. We want to, if possible, challenge some of the high mortality properties to demonstrate a reduction in mortality over time. Once they see the economics and we talk about the approach taken, we hope we get some people interested in doing that. And so we'd be offering to monitor and report using the mortality calculator tool on these properties. It's a bit like a sophisticated version of a property demonstration site, if you like. In terms of extension, we just want to keep selling the message that keep records, keep records, keep records. We want to promote the use of the mortality calculator tool. As I say, it's going on the MLA website. They're selling the same old message about culling for age, having a policy. But as I say, it's very difficult to convince some people that their most productive older cows have got to go because they're most at risk. We've got to keep selling the message on wet season phosphorus and the implications it has. And I wish more people could have access to the Breed Cow Plus model to demonstrate to themselves that, you know, reducing mortality or management practices that reduce mortality are going to be more profitable and have a lot of other benefits as well in terms of production and profitability. So finally, we're coming to questions and comments. This is just an image of to show you that we did get off the beaten track. We had to pull up and make phone calls, make appointments anywhere we could. And before I hand over back to John, a quick question from myself is that how many females are there in Northern Australia? And according to the ABARE records, in 2010 there was about 6.5 million females, or cows and heifers joined. What does a 1% drop in mortality represent across Northern Australia? Well, something like 65,000 additional females into the system. And that could have a major effect on the northern beef industry. So, John, I'll pull up there. I'm sorry I'm a bit over time.
That's all good. Thanks, Dave. So, indeed, we do have a few questions. So, so questions and comments. So I'll do questions first. So, how did you account for utilisation? So, that is the relative stocking rate versus the safe stocking rate for that region, or the percentage utilisation of pastures?
Sorry, John, I'm not hearing that.
Yeah. How did you account for utilisation? That is the relative stocking rate versus safe stocking rate for that region, or the percentage utilisation of pastures?
That's something we didn't measure. We weren't able to measure accurately anyway. We asked questions about what country was being used on the lease, but we didn't get sufficiently accurate records to come up with anything meaningful on that front.
Okay, that's fine. Another question here is, Steve, there was no mention of stocking rate as a factor influencing breeder mortality. Why was that?
That's really similar to the last question. We did ask questions about carrying capacity and stocking rate, but when you're relying on what a manager or owner is telling you, and we couldn't validate those observations or what someone was telling us, it became fairly difficult to interpret, and it just became one of those factors or variable that we couldn't accurately score and as a result interpret. So very similar to the last question, something we weren't able to do properly.
Okay, that's fine. From your discussions with producers, did you get an inkling as to why record keeping isn't as high a priority as it could be?
Oh, well, having been a producer once upon a time, and I can relate, I've got a bit of empathy for them, but it's time management. It's, you know, so much to do, and it's relatively easy when you've got a family, reasonable sized family business or corporation, but when there's only you and the kids and or mum and whatever, you know, there's just not enough people to do everything, and you know, the animal husbandry, animal welfare, all those sort of things come first, and unfortunately record keeping comes second, but it's something that I'd really like to see improve, but I think that's the main reason. It's all about time management.
Sure. Now, you were talking about the differences between the steer and breeder mortality, and you kind of asked if anyone had ideas. Well, a couple of people have come forward. So the first one is, differences between steer and breeder mortality may reflect different management of different classes of animals. What do you think of that, Steve?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. If I can give an example, I know in Queensland in the north and in parts of Western Australia in the north, we were told by managers and owners that they would put their most valuable cattle, their steers, their weaners and yearlings, onto the river country being their best country. But we know over those years that we measured, there was some major episodes of flooding, and the other extreme was dry times, and so they told us that they lost many thousands of cattle on the river country for one reason or another, and that would certainly be contributing to some of the results that you've seen today, for sure.
Sure. And one more suggestion. Good condition steers are also at higher risk of 3-day sickness than breeders, which are usually in lighter condition.
Yep, I agree with that. I wish we had more data on, we have some data on what age steers were dying, whether they were, you know, straight out of the breeding cradle or a bit later on, but we didn't have sufficient data to extrapolate. But yeah, point taken. Lots of suggestions have been made, even, you know, people losing cattle from, you know, dishonest people, you know, removing male cattle, but we just don't know. But yeah, 3-day sickness could be one of those reasons.
And with 3-day sickness, do you consider that a problem across the north?
Oh, it's a problem depending on the season, every year. Yeah, I know after floods in central Queensland and North Queensland, for example, yeah, it can be a horrific series of events where a lot of cattle will die, male cattle.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And just one final comment, so about the numbers that you posed at the end. So the suggestion is that the 6.5 million cattle in northern Australia would include the endowed areas, so the 1% decrease in mortality would result in a lower increase in the number of breeders. Do you agree with that? Yeah, I think I see what the person's saying. Yeah, it couldn't be, that 1% couldn't be implied across the whole number of 6.5 million. Yeah, point taken. Okay. And finally, just a question for clarification. Did you do any work looking at which month that the animals died in?
No, we didn't. We weren't able to reliably collect that sort of data. No, just impossible to do, I'm afraid.
Yep, sure. Okay, so folks, we're a little bit over time, so I'll hold questions there. And Steve, you're happy for people to contact you afterwards, like we'll supply your contact details?
Of course.
Great. So I'm aware there's just a couple of polls that you'd like us to do now, so I'll just launch this one. So we're interested to know, how much more research do you think should go towards further investigating the female mortalities? And we'll ask that for male following. So for female, do you think much more, some, little or none? So if you can just quickly indicate that. I can see most people have submitted their answers, so I'll close it off in 3, 2, 1, and I'll share those results. So Steve, the numbers are saying that 38% are saying that much more, and 63% are saying some more. So I'll hide that, and now just move on to the next one, which is looking at the male mortality. So same question, but for males, so much, some, little or none. Good, and I'll close that off in 3, 2, and 1. I'll just share those results with everyone. So Steve, it's interesting, it's a 50-50 split between much more and some more.
Good.
That's good. So I'll now swap over and put on my presentation. Oh, that didn't work. Let me try that again. Great. Okay. So, folks, as in all good events, we'd really appreciate your feedback afterwards. So, in due course, I'll be sending you an email that's got a link to the recording and also to an online survey. So we'd really appreciate it if you could complete that for us. So, Steve, on behalf of today's audience, I'd really like to thank you for sharing the results from your project. Like, it was pretty complex in parts, but thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm sure that we'll look forward to seeing your Excel spreadsheet up on the MLA website in due course. And also a big thank you to our attendees for coming along today and interacting so well with us. We just love your questions. So thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Until we meet again, farewell for now.
Thank you.